A quiet veteran found a dying puppy in the snow. Then he discovered who left him there. "Give the dog here. I won't let you ruin my business," Fritz roared, bursting into Hans's home, knife glinting. The old veteran, Hans, stood his ground, cane in hand. "Sturm is family, not your trash," he declared. In that tense moment, little Sturm launched himself at Fritz, biting his leg as Hans struck the intruder with his cane, neighbors alerting the police. To find out what happened next and hear the incredible full story of a veteran's love and a puppy's resilience, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and listen to the entire gripping tale. The wind, a howling banshee, clawed at the shutters of Hans's small cottage, each gust a fresh assault against the aging wood. Snow, thick and relentless, had been falling for 2 days, transforming the familiar landscape around his isolated patch of land on the outskirts of Hamburg into an alien, white desert. Inside, the fire in the old stove sputtered, a feeble defense against the bitter chill that seeped through the walls. Hans, 67 years etched onto his face like a roadmap of harsh winters, sat hunched in his worn armchair, the silence of the room broken only by the storm's fury and the occasional crackle of the fire. Then a sound, faint, almost lost in the wind's roar, but undeniably there. A whimper, thin and desperate, like a needle piercing the thick blanket of the storm. Hans froze, his head, with its thinning gray hair, cocked. He strained his ears. It came again, a little stronger this time. A tiny cry of distress, swallowed almost immediately by another blast of wind. Dismissing it as a trick of the storm, a phantom sound born of his solitude, he tried to settle back. But the sound persisted, a fragile thread of suffering weaving its way through the blizzard's symphony. An old, almost forgotten instinct stirred within him. He rose slowly, his joints protesting, and pulled on his heavy, moth-eaten greatcoat. The effort was considerable. He grabbed the sturdy walking stick leaning by the door, more for balance in the drifts than for any infirmity he'd readily admit. Outside, the world was a maelstrom of white. Snow stung his face, and the wind threatened to tear the breath from his lungs. He squinted against the blizzard, visibility near zero. Where had the sound come from? He took a tentative step off the porch, sinking knee-deep into a fresh drift. He pushed forward, a hunched figure battling the elements, driven by a sound that could easily be nothing. Then he saw it, a dark patch against the stark white under a skeletal, snow-laden bush near the edge of his property line. As he drew closer, the patch resolved into a small, shivering form. A puppy, a German shepherd by the looks of it, no more than a few months old. Its black and tan fur was matted with ice and snow, its tiny body trembling violently. Its eyes, large and dark, were dull with cold and exhaustion. A thin trickle of blood, stark crimson against the white fur of its back, oozed from a shallow, ragged gash. It let out another pitiful whimper, a sound that seemed to wrench something in Hans's frozen heart. Who could have done this? Who could leave a creature so small and defenseless to die in such a brutal, indifferent storm. Hans Kruger was a man sculpted by silence and survival. His 67 years had been a tumultuous journey, the early decades marked by the rigid discipline of military service, including a harrowing tour in Bosnia that had left scars both visible and deeply hidden. The physical wounds had healed into pale lines on his weathered skin, but the psychological shrapnel remained lodged within, manifesting as a profound reticence, a preference for solitude that had only intensified with time. His small, isolated cottage, nestled on the bleak, wind-swept plains on the rural outskirts of Hamburg, was more a hermitage than a home. He'd retreated there after the accident, a senseless, icy collision on a winter road years ago that had claimed his wife, Clara, and their teenage daughter, Lena. The vibrant colors of his life had bled out that day, leaving behind a monochrome existence. The laughter, the warmth, the shared dreams, all were now ghosts that whispered in the empty rooms and rustled in the tall grasses surrounding his property. His days were governed by a Spartan routine: up before dawn, a meager breakfast, then tending to the necessities of his self-sufficient, if stark, life. Chopping wood for the stove, mending fences against the encroaching wilderness, perhaps a walk along the desolate tracks if the weather permitted, his old service pistol tucked away, a relic of a past he couldn't entirely shed. He spoke to almost no one. The nearby villagers kept their distance, respecting his unspoken desire for isolation, or perhaps intimidated by the gruff, unyielding exterior he presented to the world. They saw a recluse, a man hardened by an unknown past, perhaps a little unhinged by grief. They didn't see the quiet torment, the recurring nightmares that still transported him back to the crackle of gunfire and the scent of fear, nor the aching void left by Clara and Lena. His only regular human contact, if it could be called that, was with Anna Bauer, the local veterinarian. Anna, a practical woman in her late 40s with a no-nonsense empathy, had known Hans's wife. She'd been the one to treat their old family dog, Rex, years ago. Now, she occasionally dropped by under the pretext of checking if he needed supplies when the weather turned particularly foul, a silent acknowledgment of his solitude and perhaps a lingering loyalty to Clara's memory. Hans tolerated these visits, his responses clipped, yet a flicker of something less guarded sometimes surfaced in his eyes when she spoke of animals. The world outside Hans's immediate, self-imposed exile was one he largely ignored. Hamburg, with its bustling port and vibrant city life, felt a million miles away, though it was only an hour's drive. His pension covered his meager needs. He read old books, listened to the crackle of the radio for news of distant storms and conflicts, and watched the seasons turn with a detached stoicism. The simmering tensions of the world, the daily dramas of others, rarely pierced his cocoon. His own conflict was internal, a long, drawn-out ceasefire with his memories. He desired nothing more than to be left alone, to let the days pass until his own winter finally claimed him. The landscape around him, especially in the grip of a harsh North German winter like this one, mirrored his internal state, vast, empty, and unforgiving. The biting wind often seemed to carry the echoes of his lost loved ones, their voices just out of reach, a constant, melancholic soundtrack to his solitude. The discovery of the puppy in the snow was like a stone dropped into the still, frozen pond of Hans's existence. Kneeling in the biting wind, the tiny, shivering creature in his large, rough hands, something shifted within him. It wasn't a conscious decision, but a raw, protective instinct that overrode years of self-imposed emotional numbness. The blood on its fur, the shallow, cruel-looking gash on its back. This wasn't just a stray lost in the storm. This was an act of deliberate cruelty. He carried the puppy back to the cottage, his movements surprisingly gentle for a man more accustomed to the unyielding nature of wood and metal. Inside, he laid the near lifeless form on an old wool blanket near the sputtering stove, the only source of warmth in the frigid room. The puppy was terrifyingly still, its breathing shallow and erratic. For a moment, Hans feared he was too late. His first coherent thought was Anna. He fumbled for his old, rarely used mobile phone, his fingers stiff with cold and a tremor he couldn't control. Anna answered on the third ring, her voice calm and professional. Hans, usually a man of few words, found himself speaking in urgent, fragmented sentences describing the puppy, the cold, the wound. Despite the treacherous road conditions, Anna arrived within the hour, her small jeep battling through the accumulating drifts. Her expression turned grim as she examined the puppy. "Hypothermia is severe, Hans," she said, her voice gentle but firm as she worked, taking its temperature, listening to its faint heartbeat. "Malnourished, too. And this wound." She carefully cleaned the gash on its back. It's clean, almost surgical, but ragged, not an animal bite. Looks like it was made by a sharp blade. A knife, maybe. Deliberate. Hans's jaw tightened, a muscle flickering along his cheekbone. The thought of someone intentionally harming such a defenseless creature ignited a cold fury within him, an emotion he hadn't felt with such intensity for years. Anna managed to get a little warm fluid into the puppy and administered an injection. It's touch and go, Hans. If it makes it through the night, maybe. The cold is the biggest enemy now, and the infection risk from that wound. As she was repacking her bag, her fingers brushed against something tangled in the puppy's matted fur near its neck. She carefully worked it free. It was a small, broken piece of a cheap nylon collar, and attached to it, a tiny, tarnished metal tag. She squinted at the inscription. "Hundezucht, Falke," she read aloud. "Falcon Kennel. I've heard of them. Big operation somewhere north of here. They supply a lot of pet shops, even some security firms. I think Hundezucht Falke." The name meant nothing to Hans, but it was a tangible link, a thread leading back to whoever had discarded this small life like so much trash. He looked at the puppy, now named Sturm in his mind. Storm, for the tempest that had brought him. A fierce, unfamiliar protectiveness surged through him. His initial, almost reflexive act of rescue was solidifying into something more. His first goal was clear. Sturm had to survive. He wouldn't let another life slip away in the cold. And then he would find out who at Hunderzucht Falk was responsible for this. The old soldier in him, long dormant, began to stir. This wasn't just about a foundling puppy anymore. This was about a wrong that needed to be righted. His quiet, empty world had been breached, and Hans Kruger, against all his ingrained tendencies, was about to engage. The first few days were a tense vigil. Hans, with meticulous care learned from forgotten field medical training and Anna's instructions, nursed Sturm. He fed the puppy tiny amounts of warm broth, kept the fire stoked high, and regularly cleaned the wound on its back, which Anna had stitched. Sturm remained perilously weak, but a flicker of life, a stubborn refusal to surrender, burned in its small body. Slowly, painstakingly, the shivering lessened, and its breathing grew stronger. By the end of the week, Sturm could lift its head and even manage a weak lap of water. A fragile bond began to form between the gruff veteran and the tiny survivor. Hans found himself talking to the puppy, gruff murmurs at first, then longer sentences, recounting old stories he hadn't thought of in years, the words filling the silence of his cottage. Sturm, in return, would watch him with growing trust in its dark, intelligent eyes, occasionally letting out a soft sigh. About 10 days after his rescue, Sturm, now able to take a few wobbly steps, began to whine, nudging Hans's hand and then looking pointedly towards the back door, towards the snow-covered field where the drifts were deepest. Hans, initially dismissive, found the puppy's insistence unsettling. Bundling them both against the lingering chill, he followed Sturm outside. The puppy, with surprising determination, led him to a particular spot near a stand of skeletal birch trees, a place Hans rarely ventured. Sturm began to paw weakly at the frozen crust of snow, whimpering, a sound of profound distress. Puzzled, and with a growing sense of unease, Hans fetched a shovel. The ground was hard, the snow packed deep. As he dug, the shovel struck something soft beneath the surface. He cleared away the snow carefully. A dirty, tattered burlap sack, his heart constricted. With trembling hands, he pulled it open. Inside lay 3 more German Shepherd puppies, almost identical to Sturm in size and coloring, their small bodies frozen solid. They had been dumped, left to the mercy of the blizzard. Sturm nuzzled the sack, a low, mournful cry escaping its throat. The sight punched the air from Hans's lungs. This wasn't just negligence. This was a massacre. Sturm was the sole survivor of a discarded litter. The cruelty of it was staggering. He gently recovered the sack, marking the spot with a heavy stone. The image of those frozen innocents seared itself into his mind. His resolve hardened into cold steel. This was no longer just about Sturm's abuser. It was about an operation that treated life with such callous disregard. He spoke to Anna, his voice tight with suppressed rage. She, too, was horrified. "Hunderzucht Falke," she repeated, shaking her head. "They have a slick website, all happy dogs and green fields. But I've heard whispers. Hans. Rumors about overcrowding, sick animals being sold. Nothing ever proven. Hans, a man who actively avoided human contact, knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed information, a way to pierce Falk's respectable facade. He thought of journalists, but the idea of dealing with the press was abhorrent. Anna, however, mentioned a freelance investigative journalist she'd once met at a conference, Greta Voss, known for her tenacity and discretion, particularly in animal welfare cases. Reluctantly, Hans agreed. Greta Voss was younger than Hans expected, sharp-eyed and direct. She listened to Hans's clipped, unemotional account, her expression growing more serious as he described Sturm's condition and the discovery of the other puppies. The Hundezucht Falketag was their only solid lead. Their initial investigation was cautious. Greta dug into Falk's business records, permits, and any public complaints. The kennel was a large, legally registered enterprise, owned by a corporation, but managed locally by a man named Fritz Meissner. Meissner, she discovered, had a reputation for being ruthless in business and had faced minor lawsuits in the past, none directly related to animal cruelty, but painting a picture of a man who cut corners. Hans, meanwhile, his old military habits resurfacing, decided on some discreet reconnaissance. He drove out to the area where Hundezucht Falke was located, a sprawling compound surrounded by high fences, security cameras visible. He didn't try to get close, just observed from a distance, noting the comings and goings of delivery vans and staff vehicles. On his second visit, a black SUV pulled up beside his parked car. Two burly men in Falk uniforms got out, their expressions unfriendly. "Can we help you, sir?" one asked, his tone polite but with an underlying menace. "This is private property." Hans, offering a mumbled excuse about being lost, drove away, but the message was clear. They were observant and unwelcoming of scrutiny. The stakes were rising. Greta Voss, using her network of contacts, managed to track down a former employee of Hundezucht Falk, a young woman named Elsa, who had worked in the kennels for 6 months before quitting abruptly. Elsa was initially terrified to speak, citing a non-disclosure agreement and a palpable fear of Fritz Meissner. However, Greta's patient persistence, coupled with an assurance of anonymity and an appeal to Elsa's conscience, eventually persuaded her to meet in a discreet location far from Falk's influence. The meeting took place in a quiet corner of a bustling Hamburg market hall, the anonymity of the crowd providing a thin veil of security. Elsa, pale and nervous, painted a grim picture of life and death inside Hundezucht Falke. She described endless rows of cramped concrete pens, often housing multiple dogs in unsanitary conditions. Puppies, she said, were a commodity, churned out with relentless efficiency. Veterinary care was minimal, reserved only for animals deemed valuable enough for sale at premium prices. The imperfect ones, those with minor flaws, the wrong markings, or those who fell ill, were considered disposable. Meissner, he has a protocol for them, Elsa whispered, her voice trembling. Especially the young ones that don't meet breed standards or are too weak to sell quickly. They don't waste vet bills on them. They're cold. Hans, listening intently beside Greta, felt a familiar coldness grip him. The word cold hung in the air, clinical and brutal. Sturm's wound, the other frozen puppies. It all began to make a horrifying kind of sense. Greta pressed gently. How are they cold, Elsa? And what happens to them? Elsa hesitated, tears welling in her eyes. Sometimes it's an injection, if they think someone might be looking. Other times, it's cruder, for the newborns or very young ones deemed unsellable, especially if there's a surplus or they need to make space quickly. Meisner or one of his trusted men would take them out back. There's a patch of woods bordering the property, he used to say. Let nature take its course. Sturm, a litter, abandoned in a blizzard. That sounds exactly like something he would do to avoid the cost and effort of humane euthanasia and disposal, especially if they were already ailing. Then came the revelation that shifted everything. There was an incident, Elsa continued, her voice barely audible. Just before I left, a new government inspector was rumored to be making surprise visits to breeding facilities after some bad press about puppy mills. Meisner panicked. He had a whole section of kennels with dogs in very poor condition, some pregnant, some with untreated infections. He didn't want any chance of them being seen. He ordered a mass cleanup. Elsa described how, over 2 nights, dozens of dogs, including pregnant females and older breeding stock deemed spent, were loaded onto an unmarked van and driven away. She didn't know their ultimate fate, but she'd heard Meisner on the phone afterwards, talking about resolving the surplus problem and minimizing exposure. This was the turning point. The scope of cruelty was far greater than Hans had initially imagined. It wasn't just about one discarded litter. It was a systematic, profit-driven operation built on suffering and deceit, orchestrated by Fritz Meisner. The vague rumors Anna had heard were just the tip of the iceberg. Hundezucht Falke wasn't just negligent, it was a death camp for unwanted animals, hidden behind a veneer of legitimacy. Hans looked at Greta, his weathered face set in grim lines. The reclusive veteran, who had sought only peace from the ghosts of his past, now found himself facing a new, tangible enemy. His initial goal of finding justice for Sturm and the dead puppies expanded into a much larger, more dangerous mission: to expose Fritz Meisner and shut down Hundezucht Falke for good. He could no longer remain a passive observer or a reluctant investigator. The knowledge Elsa had shared was a burden, a call to action he couldn't ignore. There was no turning back to his quiet, isolated life. Not until this was confronted. The old soldier, who thought his wars were over, realized he had one more fight left in him. Elsa's testimony, though horrifying, was still largely anecdotal. Greta knew that to bring down an operation like Hundezucht Falke, especially one managed by a man as ruthless and careful as Fritz Meisner, they needed irrefutable visual evidence. The anonymous tip-offs and rumors had circulated for years, without effect. This time had to be different. Hans, galvanized by the new understanding of Falk's systemic cruelty, found his old military training kicking in. The lethargy that had clung to him for years began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, focused anger. He and Greta spent hours poring over satellite maps of the Falk compound and its surroundings, cross-referencing Elsa's descriptions of the layout, the main kennel blocks, Meissner's office, the backwoods used for disposals. Their first challenge was Meissner's awareness. The encounter Hans had with Falk's security had likely flagged him as suspicious. Greta, too, suspected her initial, more overt inquiries might have put Meissner on alert. They needed to be smarter, more covert. The intimidation tactics began subtly. One morning, Hans found a dead crow lying on his doorstep, its neck broken. It could have been an accident, a cat's kill, but its placement felt deliberate, a silent warning. A few days later, the tires on his ancient truck were slashed overnight. No note, no direct accusation, just a growing sense of being watched, of an unseen pressure mounting. These incidents, while minor in themselves, preyed on Hans's mind, stirring up old anxieties, the feeling of being hunted that he remembered from Bosnia. Sturm, sensitive to Hans's moods, would stay close, a warm, reassuring presence, but his safety now became an added source of worry for Hans. Hans fortified his small cottage as best he could, checking the locks, ensuring the shutters were secure. He started carrying his old service pistol again on his property, not out of aggression, but from a grim sense of preparedness. He was a civilian now, an old man, but the instincts of a soldier facing an unseen enemy were deeply ingrained. Greta, meanwhile, worked on a new strategy. She proposed trying to get a camera inside, or at least close enough to document the conditions or the disposal methods Elsa had described. She researched high-powered telephoto lenses and discreet recording devices. They discussed the possibility of using a drone, but the airspace around Falk was likely monitored. The pressure affected Hans. Sleep became more elusive, his days punctuated by a heightened vigilance. He found himself scanning the tree line constantly, jumping at unexpected noises. The quiet solitude he had once cherished now felt like a vulnerable exposure. He even considered sending Sturm away, perhaps to Anna, for safety, but the thought of parting with the puppy, his only companion, his reason for this fight, was unbearable. Greta, sensing Hans's strain, tried to shoulder more of the investigative burden. She attempted to cultivate other sources, perhaps current employees who were disillusioned, but Meissner ran a tight ship, his staff either loyal or too afraid to speak out. One of Greta's discreet inquiries to a contact at a local animal transport company yielded a small but significant piece of information. Falk's unmarked vans often made late-night runs to a remote landfill site known for lax oversight, and also, occasionally, to a rendering plant in another district. This opened up new avenues for potential surveillance. They decided to focus on documenting these nocturnal movements. It meant long, cold nights of waiting in Greta's car, parked in concealed spots, observing Falk's gaits. Hans, despite his age and the discomfort, insisted on accompanying her. His night vision was still sharp, his patience honed by years of watchfulness. During these vigils, they talked, Hans slowly opening up about his past, about Clara and Lena, about the emptiness the puppy had begun to fill. Greta listened, understanding that this fight was not just about animal cruelty for Hans. It was about reclaiming a part of himself that had died long ago. Their new plan began to take shape. To follow one of Falk's vans on its late-night run and document what it was carrying and where it was going. It was riskier, more proactive, and carried the potential for direct confrontation. But they both knew that without damning visual proof, Meisner would continue to operate with impunity. The opportunity came during a week of freezing rain and fog, a miserable stretch of weather that offered both cover and increased risk. Greta got a tip from her transport contact. A late-night movement was scheduled from Falk, likely one of their disposal runs. Hans and Greta prepared meticulously, equipping Greta's unassuming car with a dash cam and a more powerful handheld camera with night vision capabilities. Hans, his face grim, brought along a heavy-duty flashlight and his sturdy walking stick. They positioned themselves a safe distance from Falk's main gate, hidden down a muddy access track. Hours passed in chilled silence. Finally, after midnight, the gates opened and a plain white van, its windows blacked out, emerged and turned onto the main road, heading away from Hamburg. Greta pulled out, keeping several car lengths behind. Her headlights dimmed. The van led them on a circuitous route through dark country lanes, eventually turning onto an unpaved road leading towards a notoriously grim industrial rendering plant, an operation that processed animal carcasses. "This is it," Greta murmured, her knuckles white on the steering wheel. As they neared the plant's dimly lit entrance, the Falk van pulled into a gated service area. Greta parked further back, partially concealed by a row of overgrown conifers, and they began filming. Through the telephoto lens, they could see two men from the Falk van unloading heavy, sealed plastic barrels. The barrels were too uniform, too numerous for typical veterinary waste. One barrel slipped as it was being moved, its lid popping partially open. For a horrifying instant, the camera caught a glimpse of what looked like small, matted fur. Limbs. "Puppies!" Dozens of them, packed callously. The men quickly resealed it, their movements furtive, constantly scanning their surroundings. They handed over paperwork to a plant worker who seemed indifferent before driving off. Greta had the footage. It was grainy, shot from a distance, but the implications were sickeningly clear. This was evidence of mass disposal, corroborating Elsa's story. As they were about to leave, their relief was cut short. Headlights appeared behind them, approaching fast. A dark SUV, identical to the one that had confronted Hans weeks earlier, roared up the track, blocking their exit. Fritz Meisner himself emerged from the passenger side, his face contorted with rage. The driver, a large, thuggish man Hans recognized from Falk's security, got out, holding a heavy tire iron. Well, Meisner sneered, his voice like gravel. "The busybody journalist and the old fool. Did you get some nice pictures for your scrapbook?" Hans felt a surge of cold adrenaline. He stepped out of the car, placing himself between Meisner and Greta, who was frantically trying to conceal the camera. "Leave her alone, Meisner," Hans said, his voice surprisingly steady. "Your game is over." Meisner laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "My game? It's only just beginning for you two." He nodded to his man. "Get the camera and teach them a lesson about interfering in other people's business." The thug advanced. Hans raised his walking stick, not as a weapon of attack, but as a barrier. This was it, the confrontation he had both dreaded and, on some level, prepared for. He was old, outmanned, but he wouldn't break. As the thug lunged, Hans parried the blow aimed at Greta, the impact jarring his arm. The dark night of the soul wasn't just a metaphor. It was here, on a desolate road, facing a man who embodied the cruelty he'd set out to fight. Success seemed impossibly distant. He could hear Sturm barking frantically from inside his coat, where he'd tucked the pup for warmth and safety during the stakeout. The small barks, surprisingly fierce, seemed to momentarily startle the advancing thug. The thug, momentarily surprised by the fierce barking from Hans's coat and Hans's unexpected resilience, hesitated. That split second was all Hans needed. He brought his heavy walking stick down hard on the man's extended wrist, eliciting a howl of pain and causing the tire iron to clatter onto the muddy ground. Before Meisner could react, Greta, seeing her chance, slammed her car door open into the thug's side as he staggered, sending him sprawling. Meisner, enraged, lunged for Hans himself, his face a mask of fury. "You old bastard. I'll kill you and that mutt." But Hans, fueled by adrenaline and a lifetime of survival instincts, sidestepped the clumsy attack. Sturm, sensing the direct threat to Hans, wriggled partially free from Hans's coat and sank his needle-sharp puppy teeth into Meisner's outstretched hand. Meisner screamed, more in surprise and anger than severe pain, and recoiled. At that precise moment, blue lights flashed at the end of the unpaved road, rapidly approaching. Greta, during the brief confusion, had managed to dial emergency services. Her earlier tip-off about the Falk van's suspicious route now culminating in a swift police response to her distress call reporting an assault. 2 police cars skidded to a halt, officers spilling out. Meisner and his disabled thug, caught red-handed, attempting to assault Hans and Greta, with the rendering plant as a grim backdrop, had no escape. Meisner tried to bluster, to claim Hans and Greta were trespassing, harassing him, but the officers, already briefed on potential illegal activities connected to Falk from Greta's earlier, more formal communications with the specific Animal Welfare Division, were not easily swayed. The sight of the tire iron, Hans's age, and Greta's clear distress painted a different picture. While Meisner and his associate were being detained, one officer, on Greta's urgent insistence, inspected the Falk van. The residual stench and a few overlooked strands of fur in the back were enough to raise serious concerns. Coupled with Greta's footage from the rendering plant and her earlier evidence, the police now had more than enough for a warrant to search Hundezucht Falke. The tide had irrevocably turned. Meisner's reign of cruelty, built in the shadows, was about to be dragged into the harsh light of justice, not by a dramatic raid he could anticipate, but by his own violent overreach on a lonely road. The arrest of Fritz Meissner and his associate, combined with Greta Voss's meticulously gathered evidence, triggered an immediate and comprehensive investigation into Hundezucht Falke. The footage from the rendering plant showing the disposal of barrels likely containing culled puppies was particularly damning. When authorities raided the Falk compound the next day, they found conditions that, while cleverly masked in areas accessible to the public, were deplorable in the hidden breeding sections and isolation pens. Dozens of animals were found neglected, sick, and living in squalor. The ensuing legal battle was lengthy, but Meissner's aggressive actions against Hans and Greta, coupled with the overwhelming evidence of animal cruelty and illegal disposal methods, sealed his fate. He was convicted on multiple charges and received a substantial prison sentence, along with a lifetime ban from owning or operating any animal-related business. Hundezucht Falke was shut down permanently, its assets seized. The rescued dogs, many traumatized and in poor health, were taken in by a coalition of local animal shelters and welfare organizations. Greta's articles, published with Hans's reluctant consent, he insisted his full name not be used, preferring the moniker "the Veteran," sparked public outrage and a surge in donations and volunteer support for the rescued animals. Many, after rehabilitation, found loving homes. Hans returned to his small cottage, the silence no longer feeling empty, but peaceful. Sturm, growing rapidly into a strong, intelligent young dog, was his constant companion. The ordeal had changed Hans. While he remained a man of few words, the hard shell around his heart had cracked. He found a quiet satisfaction in Sturm's recovery and in the knowledge that he had made a difference. He even started exchanging occasional, brief greetings with villagers he encountered on his walks with Sturm, a small but significant shift. Anna Bauer visited more regularly, no longer under pretext, but as a friend. The nightmares of Bosnia didn't vanish entirely, but they were less frequent, their sharp edges softened by the warmth of Sturm, sleeping at the foot of his bed. He had faced a different kind of enemy, one driven by greed and cruelty, and he had not faltered. In saving Sturm, Hans had, in a profound way, also saved himself, finding a renewed sense of purpose and a reason to engage with life again. The whispers in the wind still carried echoes of his past, but now they were joined by the happy panting of a loyal dog trotting faithfully by his side through the snow-cleared fields.